They told her to step away from the piano. "She's just the janitor," someone whispered. Another voice, sharper, amused, added, "Don't let her scratch the Steinway." Laughter rippled through the rehearsal hall, casual and cruel. Elise Marlowe stood still beneath the stage lights, a mop still in her hand, her work boots squeaking faintly on the polished floor. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved. She had simply looked at the instrument like someone staring at the ghost of a language they used to speak. No one knew who she was. No one cared. Until she sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. The moment that followed didn't just silence a room. It shook a system. This is not the story of a concert. It's the story of a reckoning. And if you've ever been underestimated for what you look like, stay. Because the note she played next will change what you believe is possible. By the time Elise Marlowe turned 33, she had become nearly invisible. At the Northbridge Conservatory of Music, a glass and marble institution perched atop a hill like it was too refined to touch the ground, she existed only in the peripheral vision of others. Students passed her in hallways without acknowledgement. Professors nodded vaguely as they stepped over the yellow caution sign she had placed beside freshly mopped tiles. Some assumed she didn't speak English. Others didn't assume anything at all. She wore the same uniform each day, a grey crew neck, black cargo pants, and scuffed boots. Her long dark hair was always tied back, her ID badge unreadable from years of wear. She clocked in early, cleaned quietly, ate lunch alone on the back steps, and disappeared before dusk. No one ever asked what her name was. They should have. Because once, Elise Marlowe had been a child prodigy. At age 7, she had performed Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu on a local news channel, her feet barely reaching the pedals. By 9, she was touring with a youth orchestra across Europe. Her hands-long, quick, unnervingly graceful were once studied in academic journals for their anatomical precision. She didn't read sheet music so much as absorb it. Her memory was photographic. Her phrasing, instinctive. But brilliance is fragile when it's left unprotected. Elise's mother, a single parent and former bar singer, did everything she could to keep her daughter's talent alive, busking, waiting tables, ironing clothes late into the night. But cancer does not wait for hard work to catch up. When her mother passed away during Elise's final year of high school, everything unraveled. Scholarships vanished. Applications went unanswered. Legal guardianship was a maze. Elise was placed into a foster system that had no patience for concertos. She didn't play for a decade. She didn't talk about that decade either. When she resurfaced in the city again quietly, without announcement, it wasn't to chase stages, it was to survive. She took the custodial job at Northbridge because it was steady, because no one there would recognize her name, because pianos lived in every hallway, and even if she couldn't touch them, she could listen. And she did. Every night, after the halls had emptied and the echoes of rehearsals had settled into silence, Elise would find an unused practice room and sit in the corner. She didn't play not at first. She'd rest her hands on her knees and feel the resonance of the building, like the way her mother used to hum lullabies against her back. It wasn't about reclaiming lost glory. It was about remembering who she'd once been before grief, before the world stopped caring. It was in those quiet moments that something inside her stirred not ambition, not revenge, but presence. And slowly, impossibly, she began to play again. Not for anyone else, not for applause, just a few notes, then a scale, then a chord progression, always soft, always unfinished. As if she was speaking a language she was afraid to mispronounce. Unbeknownst to her, someone noticed. Professor Lionel Thorne, a retired composer who had returned to Northbridge as a guest lecturer, happened to pass by one evening and heard the music drifting from a supposedly empty wing. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. And when the final note faded, he whispered to himself, "Whoever that is, isn't learning to play. She's learning to return." From that night on, he stayed late too. Because even forgotten prodigies deserve to be remembered. And sometimes, the greatest comeback begins in silence. Professor Lionel Thorne never told anyone where he went after lectures. The man had once conducted orchestras in Vienna and Tokyo, written scores for award-winning films, and turned down lifetime appointments at prestigious academies. He was known at Northbridge as an eccentric relic, still brilliant, but faded. Students mocked his analog habits, his paper notebooks, his refusal to use tablets or metronome apps. What they didn't know was that Thorne, like Elise, had once been hollowed out by loss. Perhaps that's why he recognized it in her music. It began with a knock-soft, almost embarrassed on the supply closet door where Elise kept her cleaning supplies. She turned, surprised. Professors didn't usually wander down the maintenance wing. Thorne offered no preamble. "There's a Baldwin upright in room 207, he said. "Not many use it. Needs tuning, but its tone is honest. I'll leave the key under the mat." Then he left. Elise stood there for a long time, gripping the mop handle, wondering if she had imagined it. That night, after finishing her shift, she found the key. The piano sat in a dimly lit corner of the practice room, the bench worn smooth by years of forgotten students. She sat, hesitated, then pressed middle C. It rang out slightly flat, but clear. Over the next weeks, a rhythm formed. Every Tuesday and Thursday, after the building emptied, Elise would return to room 207. Thorne never intruded. He waited in the hallway with a thermos of black tea, sometimes sketching harmonies in a leather-bound journal, other times simply listening. He didn't correct her, didn't teach, not in the traditional sense. Instead, he told stories. "This," he'd say, pointing to a passage she'd stumbled over, "should feel like standing at the edge of a cliff, not afraid to fall, but afraid to forget why you climbed." Other times, he'd place her hand on the frame of the piano, fingers spread wide. "You don't play the keys," he murmured. "You play the silence between them. Respect the silence." Elise absorbed everything. She never asked why he was helping her. He never asked what had kept her silent for so long. They both understood. Some truth better translated through music. She began composing again quiet fragments, pieces with no names. One, she titled 13 Steps Down, after the staircase where she used to sit as a girl, eavesdropping on conservatory students before her mother could afford lessons. Another, Salt, was a series of sparse, aching chords that reminded her of tears she hadn't known she still carried. One night, Thorne brought her a gift, a blank manuscript journal with a single line written on the first page. "If you're going to reclaim your voice, you might as well give it a home." Elise didn't cry, but she held the book like it was something sacred. In time, Thorne began suggesting pieces she try. Not showpieces, not sonatas to impress. No Liszt, no Rachmaninoff. Instead, Erik Satie, Arvo Pärt, composers who understood restraint, space, breath. She relearned how to phrase not for applause, but for honesty. Her left hand, once stiff from years of labor, regained its fluidity. Her right danced with new intention. Her timing slowed not because she had grown cautious, but because she had finally begun to listen. To the keys, to the instrument, to herself. Elise Marlowe was not returning to music. She was returning to meaning. And in that small, windowless room, a quiet revolution was beginning, one that would soon echo far beyond the walls of Northbridge. They called it a community rehearsal. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards overnight printed on glossy cardstock with gold-trimmed fonts. Open piano night. Students, staff, and friends welcome. Come see talent emerge from the most unexpected places. It sounded inclusive, wholesome. It was anything but. The trap had been carefully set. Colin Wexler and his circle of performance majors had grown tired of the rumors that the janitor was playing Chopin better than faculty, that Professor Thorne had discovered something. To them, Elise Marlowe was an embarrassment, An intruder. A story that shouldn't exist. So they baited her. "We'd love to hear you," one girl said brightly in the hallway, arms full of sheet music. "Don't be shy. Thorne says you're amazing." Elise had hesitated, but the look in her eyes, when someone finally spoke to her with something that sounded like belief, it cracked her. She said yes. When she arrived that Friday evening, the rehearsal hall was already packed. Not just students, faculty, parents, guests. The kind of crowd that only gathered when something strange was about to happen. The Steinway Grand had been wheeled center stage, lit from above like an altar. Elise stood at the back in her grey work uniform, hands trembling slightly. A few students turned to stare, then whispered behind raised programs. A boy near the front called out, mock cheerful, "The prodigy janitor has arrived!" Scattered laughter. Then from the stage, "Miss Marlowe, so good of you to join us." It was Colin, wearing a smug grin, standing by the microphone as if he owned the room. He gestured theatrically. "We've been dying to hear the mysterious music that's been floating through the halls. Come and grace us with a few notes." Applause followed, but it wasn't real applause. It was sharp, ironic, performed cruelty, dressed as encouragement. Elise walked forward slowly. Her boots thudded against the stage. She didn't look up. As she passed the front row, someone stuck out a foot like a joke. She flinched, barely catching herself. A girl near the aisle smirked and whispered, "Try not to break the keys." Colin pulled out a chair for her, overly gentlemanly. "We made sure the bench was cleaned. Don't worry." A few students laughed harder. Elise reached the piano. The crowd hushed, but not from awe, from tension, from the anticipation of a spectacle, a failure. She sat, placed her hands in her lap, then reached out toward the keys. A camera phone clicked. Another followed. A boy muttered just loud enough, "This is gonna be painful." Elise looked down. Her fingers hovered. She touched one key. No sound yet. Then Colin leaned into the mic and said, "Careful now. That Steinway's worth more than your entire net worth, darling." Laughter erupted. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was open, roaring, merciless. Someone whistled. Another mimicked mopping the floor in his lap. One professor in the back stood, half embarrassed, half amused, and turned away. Elise didn't move. But something in her expression shifted. Her spine straightened, her jaw locked, her eyes, quiet but burning, scanned the room as if etching every face into memory. She stood, pushed the bench back without a word, walked off the stage through the crowd that had just shredded her dignity without flinching. And when she passed Colin, she stopped just long enough to say, without looking at him, "You confuse silence with weakness. That's your first mistake." She kept walking. Behind her, the audience was still laughing, but now, uneasily. A few had stopped. A few looked at each other, uncomfortable, as if the joke had gone too far. No one applauded. No one would forget. And what none of them knew was that Elise wasn't walking away in shame. She was walking toward the moment they would all remember for the rest of their lives. The next night, the winter rehearsal hall was silent. No flyers, no banners, no performances, scheduled, at least none, announced. But every seat was filled. Whispers spread through the marble foyer like wind before a storm. "She's really coming? Is this a joke? Did the dean approve this?" No one seemed to know, but they were there. Colin Wexler sat near the back, arms folded, jaw tight. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight hit the Steinway at center stage. Then the door opened, and Elise Marlowe walked in. Not from the wings, from the main entrance. Past every student who had laughed, past every professor who had looked away. She didn't wear her uniform tonight. Just a simple black blouse, slacks, and the same work boots that had squeaked across the halls for years. No introduction. No microphone. No words. She walked to the piano, pulled back the bench, and sat. She let her hands rest on the keys but didn't play. Not yet. She breathed. The room breathed with her. Somewhere in the silence, the weight of the previous night hung like a curtain of glass ready to shatter. Then, softly, Elise began. A single note. Middle C. Held for just a moment too long. Then another. And another. It wasn't a piece anyone recognized. No Rachmaninoff. No Bach. Not even Thorne knew it. Because it wasn't written. It was remembered. The melody unfolded like a scar being traced slow, trembling, deeply personal. The right hand danced gently up the register, hesitant, unsure. The left hand followed in delay, as if catching up after years apart. It was not perfect. One note faltered. Another bent slightly sharp. But no one noticed. Because it wasn't about precision. It was about truth. With each passing measure, Elise pulled them deeper not into a song, but into her story. They heard the ache of loss in the minor intervals, the loneliness in the rests, the quiet rage in the syncopated left-hand pulses. A student near the front blinked fast, then looked down, ashamed. Another put away his phone. And when the melody climbed higher, something unexpected happened. The piano began to answer her. Not literally, but in resonance. Every hammer, every string seemed to remember her touch. As if the Steinway, once forbidden to her, had been waiting for this exact set of hands to come back home. She transitioned into a slow 6/8 meter waltz-like, but hollow, like a memory with a missing person in the photo. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm, but her face remained still, focused, almost serene. A crescendo camino loud, but deep. Rich, weighty chords rang out like thunder under glass. The room shifted. A girl in the second row covered her mouth. An administrator slowly stood from the back. Even Colin leaned forward. His smirk was gone. And then, Elise broke time. She slammed 3 clustered chords with both hands, dissonant and raw. The sound snapped like bone. People jolted in their seats. She held the final chordlet it ring, until it became unbearable and, then, silence. A full 10 seconds. No movement. No applause. And in that silence, she began again. But now the melody was different. Gentler, open, forgiving. She played with a softness that didn't ask to be heard, it allowed you to feel. Like warmth returning to frostbitten skin. It wasn't victory she played. It was release. And when she reached the final note, a high E, barely touched, she didn't let it linger. She lifted her fingers, folded her hands in her lap, and simply looked up. Not at anyone, just toward the rafters. And then she stood. No bow, no smile, no flourish, just presence. And the room broke. Applause erupted, not polite, but desperate. Chairs scraped. People stood. Some cried. Others shouted her name, though she never gave it. Professor Thorne stepped forward from the shadows, hands behind his back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Elise looked at him, nodded once, and walked off stage. As she passed Colin, he stood frozen silent, red-faced, shattered. She said nothing, because the note she'd just played said everything. Backstage, a woman from a national label reached out to shake her hand. Elise didn't take it. "I'm not for sale," she said calmly. "I just needed them to listen." And that night, for the first time in years, the walls of Northbridge didn't echo with judgment. They echoed with awe. By morning, the performance had gone viral. Someone had recorded it grainy phone footage, slightly off angle, capturing only Elise's silhouette against the Steinway. But it didn't matter. The sound carried everything. The video was titled, "The Janitor Who Played the Truth." Within 12 hours, it had over 4 million views. Music blogs lit up. Northbridge's switchboard collapsed under requests for interviews. Conservatory donors asked why her name wasn't in the program. Students who had mocked her just days before reposted the video with captions like, "I was there. I'll never forget it." Colin Wexler deactivated his social media. Elise didn't say a word. She returned to work as usual the next morning, mopping the same floors that had once echoed with laughter at her expense. But now, people moved out of her way, not out of pity, but reverence. A hush followed her, fragile and confused. Professors tried to catch her eye. Some offered clumsy compliments, others offered contracts. A man from the Vera label flew in from Los Angeles. "We'll build a debut album around your story," he said, sliding a leather folder across the table in the campus cafe. "Documentary, speaking tour, you'll never scrub another floor again." Elise opened the folder, read the first line, and closed it. "I never needed a stage," she said softly. "I needed space." He blinked, confused. "What does that mean?" "It means you're late." She stood and left the contract untouched. Others came after him. Promoters, foundation directors. One even offered to name a piano competition after her. She declined them all. Professor Thorne watched quietly as Elise walked away from opportunity after opportunity, none of which had existed before she'd made them look. "She doesn't want to be a brand," he told the dean. "She wants to be a beginning." The conservatory, meanwhile, scrambled to correct its image. A press release went out stating that Elise had been part of a hidden enrichment program for non-traditional artists. It was a lie. Students knew it. Faculty knew it. And Elise? She didn't even dignify it with a response. But she did do one thing. She wrote a letter. It was short, handwritten, and placed quietly in the suggestion box outside the registrar's office, something most people hadn't touched in years. It read, "You don't need to change your mission. You need to remember it." 3 weeks later, the conservatory announced a new pilot program, the Marlo Initiative. Open access auditions, anonymous evaluations, scholarships for undiscovered talent. They made it sound like a progressive move, but the truth was simpler. They were trying to catch up. Elise didn't attend the press conference. Instead, she stood in a small church basement on the south side of the city, surrounded by 5 children, none older than 12. One wore hearing aids. Another couldn't sit still for more than a few minutes. They'd never touched a piano before. Elise knelt beside them. She placed their fingers on the keys. "Don't worry about sounding good," she said. "Just sound like you." And for the first time, they did. They never saw it coming. Not the school. Not the system. Not even Elise herself. She had not spoken on stages, not signed a single contract, not once explained her performance. And yet, her silence traveled further than most people's shouting ever could. It began with a letter. A girl in rural Kansas wrote to Northbridge. She had no formal training, no money for lessons, just a dusty Yamaha keyboard she'd inherited from a cousin. Her letter read, "If the janitor can play like that, maybe I can too." Then, a video surfaced. A boy in Jakarta, blind from birth, playing Elise's opening melody by ear in a train station. The footage went viral under the title, Marlo's Echo. Music teachers across the country began holding unseen recitals concerts where no performer was named, no resume read, and no background questioned. The only thing that mattered was sound. And everywhere, children who had been told they were too old, too poor, too slow, too different, started to play. Not to win, to speak. Because Elise had never asked the world to notice her. She had asked it to listen. And now, for the first time in generations, it was. Thorne called it the Marlo shift. Not a revolution, not a rebellion, something quieter, deeper. A retuning of how we measure worth. One night, Elise returned to room 207. It looked smaller now. She sat at the Baldwin upright, the one she'd first played when no one was watching, and found a note taped to the music stand. It read, "I came here to clean. You showed me how to stay." No signature. Just a single pressed flower tucked inside. Elise smiled. She didn't need to know who wrote it. She already knew who they were. They were like her. And like her, they had finally heard something worth answering. Northbridge changed, but not because it wanted to. It changed because it had to. Students began submitting applications without names, just recordings. Professors petitioned to make performance evaluations blind. The conservatory's marble entryway, once lined with portraits of donors and prodigies, now featured something new: a wooden bench with no plaque. Just a pair of worn boots placed beneath it, and a small brass engraving that read, "Sound speaks louder when no one's watching." They called it the listening bench. It became a quiet place students would sit before auditions, not to prepare, but to remember why they started. Other institutions took note. A conservatory in Dublin created a program for late-blooming musicians. A youth orchestra in Nairobi began accepting players based on rhythm tapped on tabletops instead of scored sight reading. Even Ivy League schools invited Elise to speak. She never went. She was already somewhere else. In a repurposed library in Detroit, she taught children how to feel tempo through their feet. In a chapel in Marseille, she helped an autistic teen write her first melody using only colors and breath. Everywhere she went, she brought nothing but a notebook, a tuning fork, and a pencil. She didn't post on social media. She never signed autographs. Still, people knew where she had been, not from photos, but from sound. A teacher in Brazil described her visit as the day silence learned to sing. A father in Istanbul, after hearing Elise help his son with Down syndrome create a 4-note lullaby, called her a translator of forgotten voices. She left behind no recordings, no official albums. What she left behind was space. Permission. A reminder that greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it scrubs the floor for years before touching the keys again. One morning, Northbridge unveiled a new wing. It wasn't grand, but it was open literally, with glass walls, circular rooms, acoustics built for group improvisation, not solo competition. They named it the Marlo Room for Shared Sound. No bust, no statue, just a blank wall where anyone could write music in chalk. It was erased and rewritten each week. And that was the point. Because Elise's legacy was never meant to be preserved. It was meant to be passed on. No one knew where she went. There were rumors, of course. A girl in Lisbon claimed Elise had played beside her on a broken upright in a subway tunnel. A photo surfaced from a village in Patagonia, blurry, out of focus, a woman in boots, guiding a child's hand to a key. In Kyoto, monks spoke of a woman who played wind chimes with thread, turning breezes into lullabies. But Elise Marlowe never returned to Northbridge. Not because she resented it, but because she had already given it everything she had. Her final public appearance came unannounced, unrecorded. It wasn't a performance. It was a moment. A music classroom in a low-income school district had lost its funding. The last upright piano sat in the corner, untouched, with 2 keys chipped and a missing pedal. That day, Elise walked in without knocking. She didn't introduce herself. She asked one question: "What does your voice sound like, if no one's telling you what to say?" And then, she listened. When the students played awkwardly, hesitantly, beautifully, she played beside them. Not above, not louder, just beside, until the music belonged to them completely. And the next day, she was gone. No note. No spotlight. No encore. Only a single line written on the whiteboard, left in chalk. If you can hear it, it already belongs to you. Back at Northbridge, students still gather in the Marlo Room. Not to impress. Not to compete. Just to share sound. And sometimes rarely, but just enough a new player enters. Nervous, silent, uncertain. They sit. They breathe. They press one trembling key, and the room listens. Because Elise had taught them, music isn't something you earn. It's something you remember. a note buried under years of silence. A voice once denied. A truth too soft for noise but too powerful for forgetting. And that's where she lives now. Not in halls of fame, but in the hands of anyone brave enough to begin again. Elise Marlowe didn't become a legend. She became a bridge. And some nights, when the world goes quiet, if you listen closely enough, you'll hear her, still playing,